Hi, I'm Mark Rossano, founder and CEO of C6 Capital Holdings, coming to you from Primary Vision Network. Today we have a fun show looking at some of the changes that we've seen over the last couple of weeks. Things have obviously increased in Europe with Russia, Ukraine. We're going to talk about that, and then China, Taiwan, Philippines, just on a geopolitical front. And then we're going to shift into the data and what has really changed over the last few weeks, which, it's a lot, but again, we don't want to get repetitive. So we just want to look at what is happening on a global level on the widening income gaps, because it's not just the US. Then we're going to go into wage pressure, rising costs. What does that mean? Because we're now starting to see companies talk about they're increasing prices. P&G is just another of the many that are starting to increase prices with, and that should be completed by at least by September based on their commentary. Then when we look at those, but at the same time, wage pressure is increasing, prices are being passed on, and then the EU data is still coming in mixed. Italy just announced that they're going to end their movement restrictions on April 26th. Greece, I think it was the first week of May, so we're starting to get some of that movement. But then we're going to go through that EU data and then wrap it up with Asian exports, which continue to go higher around China. And then we're going to go deeper into what is happening with some of those Chinese demand components and what's happening with that Chinese data. So one thing that I think is important to kick off with, because it is very important when you think about the geopolitical front, it's what is happening with the vaccine production and exports. And here you can see that shift between China and kept and exported. So China continues to export. They're using this as a means of diplomacy to get this into the emerging markets. They've seen a slowdown in local vaccinations, which they're trying to change. But right now, that's also putting more doses for the export side. And Xi continues to talk with emerging prime ministers, presidents, to try to get those dosages through. Indonesia was the most recent. The U.S. is continuing to focus on vaccinating the local community first, and we're starting to see that, but exports are starting to increase on the back end. We did have that mix up in Maryland, which a lot of those vials were meant to go into Europe from Maryland. So again, that's where we saw some of these production numbers cut into both Canada and Europe. Now, in India is going to be the problem one, because India is obviously facing their own COVID increases. They've increased the amount that they're keeping, but they were supposed to have a fairly robust export side, because for anyone that is familiar with the pharmaceutical supply chain, India is a huge component to it, not just on the vaccine, but just across all of the medical supplies out there. So that their slowdown, their hindrance is going to reverberate through the system, specifically on the emerging market side, which also leaves it open for China to increase or try to show a bit more support for their emerging markets and try to win more favor. Now, when we talk about geopolitics, it's always important to appreciate what's happening with food and water. Food and water is going to, and not to say that anybody's going to want to kill someone else, but if you can't eat, if you can't drink, it's going to drive you to the extremes, especially for your family. And so it's always important to look at. So now corn is over $6 a bushel. We have, food prices are going in one direction. They continue going in one direction. Latin American droughts are increasing, which are creating an issue for new crops. We're already seeing a walk back in the amount of exports, or at least yield expected, while China is expected to import a significant amount and a record amount in general. All the while, the supply is becoming a bigger issue. We had Europe with a late season frost, which killed or damaged a lot of the crops. We have Russia talking about capping exports, which is not surprising in a lot of these other emerging markets, where these are things where the supply is coming lower and demand is going up. Like now, there's swine flu in Germany continuing to be fought against. Avian flu is back in Africa. Again, these are things that are becoming a bigger problem when you look at the underlying geopolitical stability of the world in general. So China's hog, poultry, fish, they're trying to figure out ways to mitigate the feed side. So because here you can see China feed demand for corn and soybean meal. They're trying to utilize more wheat and more, anything quote unquote other away from soy meal and corn to push that more into the mouths of their people, because China does have an issue with food waste. So they're trying to adjust how do they use some of the food waste to feed their growing livestock and to put more of this food into the mouths of their people, because that is becoming a bigger issue as we look at the inflation side, and more importantly, inflation for the majority. Because as we showed last week, the rich aren't seeing inflation the same way the middle class and the poor are. And this is one of those key drivers, especially for the developing world. Now, when we look at China's corn imports, which are, again, hitting all-time records, and you could just see the massive move up as China is now forecast to buy 28 million tons of the world's corn. And a lot of that is going to come from the U.S. When you look at Russia and the amount that they are able to put out on the wheat side, corn side, corn is going to become a big issue coming out of Latin America as some of those crops are late or damaged, which is going to, again, create this shortfall. So as China looks to absorb more, the supply just isn't there, which, again, is going to drive up prices. So now with corn at over $6 in the U.S., up $15 based on the way the futures work, but 15 cents based on how we're speaking, this is going to become a much bigger problem. Now, when we think about China, just to kind of round out where everything is with China, it's important to speak about what's happening in the Philippines and what's happening in Australia. So Australia has now canceled their Belt and Road deal with China. The BRI deal was with Victoria, the nation's second populous state, and it was signed in 2018, and then new parts of it were signed in 2019. So it was more about a plan of creating more unity, increasing investment in the industrial side of Victoria. It's not surprising to see it get squashed, because when we look at what it was, the initial deal, it was a framework for future cooperation and not legally binding. So again, based on how things shifted in general, it's not surprising to see some of these adjustments. Now, that's one side being said. But now when we look at what's happening in the Philippines, so the reefs China is building into artificial islands, you can see a lot of this falls under the Philippines EEZ. So the territorial claims for the Philippines includes large parts of these islands that China is now pushing onto. And now this isn't new, that we're not talking about this being new. We've known they've been doing this. The problem is their activity has accelerated. So the Philippines is supposed to be a big spot for the U.S. to put new forward missile positions. So not surprising, there is a reaction to that. So when we look at the reaction, this is a quote from the Philippines president, Duterte, saying challenging China in the South Sea will only lead to violence, and that he will only do so if Beijing drills for oil in the disputed waters. If we go there to assert our jurisdiction, it would be bloody. So he is essentially saying that it's not a time to confront China, and that he's not so much interested in the marine resources in the disputed sea. I will give them 5 Coast Guard ships, and they can chase it. They can play with each other and see who's faster, essentially making jokes. If they get the oil, that would be a time that we would act. So again, they're looking at it from the perspective of, as long as they don't touch the crude, they can fish, they can settle the assets, build out on them without issue. It's the oil that matters. But again, give an inch, they'll take a mile. So this is going to be another friction point to watch within the 9-dash line, because while the Philippines may say this, others, especially Vietnam, do not feel the same way. And this has been a friction point. And as we've seen additional runs, so in a recent movement, so Japan actually flew several missions with actual live fire, air-to-air missiles. We're seeing more actions with the USS Roosevelt in the area. Japan met up with them from, moving things closer, or about 300 miles away from Taiwan. You're seeing a shift of assets moving closer and closer to the Taiwanese Strait, as well as Taiwan mainland. This, again, is going to remain a friction point, and it's not something to be missed when we look at what's happening with China in general. It's, again, saber rattling right now, but the size of the assets are increasing. We're now flying with live fire ammo. Again, these things increase the chance for a miscommunication, a misunderstanding, an error in judgment on either side, and then a loss of life or an act of aggression could be spun, and then that's when things start to spiral out of control. Now, looking at what's happening in Russia and the Ukraine, it's going to be an important shift, because this isn't the same as the Crimea component, because now the Ukraine has amassed a significant amount of assets on the border as well. So this is not something where one side is going to be able to overwhelm or to infiltrate. This is going to be something that is very well choreographed. Now, at the same time, it is April. The area still hasn't firmed up. So when we talk about the spring thaw, do you need the snow to melt? And then when the snow melts, what happens? The ground gets soggy, and then the ground has to firm up. And that usually happens in May. So we still have an assets being amassed, but the field still can't carry the weight of a tank. So again, that's going to limit, but just based on what's been moving in the system. So the Ukraine authorities assume that there's about 40,000 troops stationed near these specific regions for number one. Another 40,000 troops are estimated to be in Crimea. And then when we look at, in general, what is being amassed right now is Ukraine we're assuming there's about 150,000 troops, and right now there's about 100,000 Russian troops, depending on where you are. And now Russia's looking to close. They've already closed the Kerch Strait, which they built across here, and to close off the Azov Sea. But now the U.S. was going to send two naval ships. They didn't, and I think it's more along the lines of trying to not be trapped in the Black Sea in case something happens with China. And instead, the U.K. is going to send two ships. So it seems like it was an agreement made where the U.S. will focus on China and the U.K. will send the same type of movement into the region instead of the U.S. to still show solidarity with NATO. Again, all of this is going to become a much bigger issue, but the territory controlled by Russia-backed separatists in this region, because there are parts of the Ukraine that are loyal to Russia, or they're not really Ukrainian, but they identify more as Russian, which is also giving them that foothold. Now, one of the things that has always been talked about was Russia's desire to build a land bridge into Crimea along along the shoreline, which would take away some key areas for the Ukraine ports and their access to the sea on obviously the eastern side of Crimea. This is going to be one to watch, because it's expensive to amass these types of individuals. On the Ukraine side, Russian side, this is not cheap. These people don't show up for free. So when you look at, okay, well, are they trying to distract from the issues that still are in the Ukraine? Russia, the economy still remains fairly weak in general. You still have some of this upheaval. There's those issues right now between the separatists, with the Navalny, who is on a hunger strike after being arrested. Again, these are these friction points when we look at what's happening within Russia on the political side, economic side. Is this a distraction? Is this something to try to create some sort of unity against the Ukraine, or is there something more behind it? Now, here's just some examples of amassing assets. So the Su-30 are in some strategic areas within Crimea. This is just some satellite photography. We'll have some satellites in general, just to give you an idea of the buildup of assets. And then when we look at some of the tanks in general, here you can see just where there's the training centers. Again, this is just showing the Russian side. The Ukrainian side still has a significant amount in the area as well. Now, some of the other key sides of the equation when we look at what is happening, we talked about water and food, and I think it's important to appreciate that after Crimea went into Russians' hands, the Ukrainians turned off the water, and this is the North Crimean Water Canal. So when you look at the water canal, obviously being dry, the Crimea happened several years ago in terms of what the impacts are. We've talked about droughts versus floods in different regions. So they've turned off the water into a key part of the region, and you've also had lack of rainfall. So now I won't even pretend that I can pronounce these names. You'll see them in the titles. But here is where we can see some of the issues right now versus the timestamps or the time differences on reservoirs within Crimea. So you can think, well, what is Russia going to do? Well, is there a water issue? Again, water and food are going to drive a lot of things. And when you look at just where things sit on the waterfront, you can see shortfalls coming through some of these key reservoirs within the region as they shrink, as there's just water being turned off, but there's more people with Russian soldiers being in the region. More people being active is going to pull down and be more aggressive on water resources. And here's kind of that round out in terms of where these reservoirs sit in general and what is happening in terms of just the shrinking sides. And again, this is not going to be adjusted quickly. There's still going to be, now there's talk about trying to find some middle ground. Russia inviting delegates. The Czech Republic is now getting more aggressive against Russia. They're having a tit for tat of kicking each other's diplomats out of the country. So again, the friction is there, and we're hoping that cooler heads prevail and that we have some sort of dialogue to understand what the intentions are. We can all assume or make assumptions. Right now, I'm just saying it's too early to see any type of movement on a military front. But this is something that just based on the positioning, if something were to happen, it would be closer to that, second to third week of May. And this is going to be one to watch closely. This could be a negotiation tactic to get people to the table, because Russia still has an issue with China. They're still supportive of India. So, and India is going to be a big battleground for China. And in what is that going to look like within Asia? So again, these are going to be some of these friction points that we want to look at. These two happen to be the hottest right now of Russia, Ukraine, and then Taiwan and China. And these are going to be those flashpoints to watch to see what develops over the next few weeks, because we're coming to that movement point, and we'll be following it. Well, hopefully we'll be able to put some context around it as things develop and move in a hopefully a non-deadly fashion. But when water and food are involved, there's always that risk for people getting a bit more aggressive to adjust. So now that we've covered that, in the next segment, we're going to go to other things that are going to drive action, which is inequality, social mobility, which is something that comes down to when we discuss the widening income gap that's been developing throughout the global world.